HighBridge, a division of Recorded Books, presents Limelight, Rush in the 80s by Martin Popoff. Read by Michael Butler Murray. Introduction. Get any pile of Rush fans together at, say, one of the many legendary Rush cons over the years, and you can quickly elicit strong opinions on what parts of the band's 80s catalog are valid and which are not. It was an action-packed decade for the boys, as they finally found themselves, by dint of their own wiles and will, in the top quartile. Not so much with Permanent Waves, but for sure come Moving Pictures, a red and black record accepted as the band's masterpiece. With Signals, Rush started challenging expectations. The 80s will mess with your head, and Rush took to messing about with all the decade had to offer, enthusiastically so, given the guys' predilection toward explorations of modernity. Keyboards and hairstyles in tandem. Geddy, Alex, and Neil took the mile when offered an inch, and by the time we got to Power Windows and Hold Your Fire, Rush was an astringent, high-strung pop band, trendy keys and synths in excess. Most fans went along for the trip, and if they weren't always happy with records like Presto, the concert halls were still filled, as the band had no problem delivering the power trio power the fans expected during a show, aided and abetted by a deep catalog of hits, more analog. And the productivity was impressive as well. Most 70s bands couldn't hold a candle to Rush's tally of 7 studio albums and 2 double live spreads in the 80s, even if the guys decided to notch back on the mega tours. Rush were regulars in Europe, but never a world band. They began to visit less frequently, also cutting back on how much of the U.S. and Canada they would hammer at repeatedly. As you may or may not know, Limelight, Rush in the 80s, is the follow-up tome to Anthem, Rush in the 70s. That book looked at the long ramp-up to the Zeppelin-esque debut album in 1974 and the arrival of a transformational force in the guise of Neil Peart, sadly and shockingly deceased from brain cancer, just as that book was getting ready to go to print. Peart, of course, became heralded as one of the greatest rock drummers of all time, and certainly one of the most air-drummed, as early as his third record with the band, 2112. Anthem then examined the band's first live album, followed by A Farewell to Kings and Hemispheres. And all of a sudden, the 70s are over, and it's time for something fresh, including technological innovations as well as the rise of MTV and the age of video. Limelight, Rush in the 80s, is the story of these subsequent years, beginning a couple of weeks into the Hades, as voiced by Morrissey, with the robust, if brief, Permanent Waves, and bowing out in November of 1989 with Presto, a record that bucked so many trends, the band found themselves kind of marginalized, or more positively, defiantly singular, sounding like no one else, while still essentially playing a form of mainstream pop. Along the way, we hear from the myriad producers Geddy, Alex, and Neil brought into the circle, not so much desperately, but avidly, curiously, looking for inspiration from industry peers. Essentially what Peter Collins and Rupert Hine, and slightly less so, Peter Henderson, brought was pop modernity, with the guys all too happy to push buttons on the latest toys, to craft a sound more in keeping with what they saw as valid and au courant, the music of grown-ups. A contentious dynamic of the book, which I argue is borne out in the music and lyrics, is that the band was seeking the respect of folks they thought were smart, folks who had good taste. You may look at that as a negative, or you might see that as the guys enthusiastically participating in the hustle and bustle of the modern world, growing intellectually, not conceding that they themselves couldn't be New World men. And becoming New World men meant that Geddy, Alex, and Neil would develop interests outside of music. Because after all, wasn't music itself moving toward the idea of multimedia? Toward this end, toward becoming well-rounded, in effect Renaissance men, as the 80s wore on, the guys pulled back from touring, spending more time on family, travel, and other creative pursuits. The business of Rush is very different in this book versus the first one, reflected in the vast difference between a show of hands and all the world's a stage. But this isn't the end of our story. Because, of course, Rush didn't stop at Presto, even if the band had slowed. More joy and much more heartbreak were to star-cross the lives of Geddy, Alex, and Neil, and the story wouldn't be complete if we didn't march forward and meet the heroes of our tale at their own individual completions. Stay tuned as we continue this loud and loving march through time toward a conclusion that now, with the recent passing of the professor, is very, very different and darker than when this trilogy began. Martin Popoff. Chapter 1. Permanent Waves. Most Promising Keyboard Player of the Year. For all the turmoil in the music industry in the late 1970s, including the changings of the guard, from rock quickly past punk into post-punk, to the recessionary year that was 1979, saved barely by the arrival of The Wall, In Through the Outdoor, and The Long Run, Geddy Lee, Alex Lifeson, and Neil Peart, a.k.a. Rush, kept moving forward from strength to strength. Their sixth album, Hemispheres, proved that the band could sell and on tour excel, despite a record that was as anti-commercial as they get. Broken Down, that record gave up a side-long song about Greek gods and a long instrumental, leaving room for only two short pieces. One of them, heavy slide rule metal, Circumstances, and the other hummable enough, but about trees fighting each other. But the awards kept coming, allowing for even more of the autonomy and validation the band attracted. By the end of the decade, Rush was undisputedly the biggest band from Canada. Still, the band wasn't making a lot of money. Rush had moved away from the days of hit singles like Closer to the Heart and Fly By Night. But the financial situation wasn't dire, and there was a sense of generosity within the Rush camp. They wanted to give back, often playing B-city gigs that might not be particularly profitable. The band also poured a lot of their profits into making their show bigger and more extravagant, any chance they got. It's a strategy that paid off. It made Rush, a still small band in 1979 and 1980, look huge. In tandem with the band's expanding maturity as a live act was their consistent growth from record to record. Permanent Waves would demonstrate a number of advancements, but these would be subtle, and in part driven by the guys changing up the environment in which they worked. We were torn at that point with what kind of music we wanted to make in terms of its length, recalls Geddy. We had fallen into this pattern of writing these really long pieces, and that started to seem formulaic to us, predictable. Complicated musical part here, this is where we do the chorus, and it kind of got boring. So we thought we still like to play long, complicated pieces. If we had our druthers, that's all we probably would do. And then there is the lyric thing. How do we bring that in, and how do we keep improving? So we came up with this idea of trying to make the long pieces, but have them much quicker. So over 5-6 minutes, as opposed to 20. Permanent Waves did not let up on the quick edits, the progressive virtuosity, the rapid arrival and dispersal of action points. But as Geddy says, it's almost as if the result was long songs defying the space-time continuum, somehow being as long as they've always been, but then there's time left over. Maybe that's also why Permanent Waves is such an irritatingly short album. It was a conscious thing to not write really long songs, seconds Alex, and what resulted from that would be fine. I remember that when we wrote these songs, it seemed like they were songs within songs, just smaller pieces. The Spirit of Radio, for example. The sequence was a very key part to it. That led to the signature guitar riff, off the top of the song. We all connected to that one thing as the center, and all these other little pieces branched out. The same thing, but much more condensed. There was something about the record that was really fresh for us, continues Geddy. It was written quickly, and the recording session was so smooth. Or maybe it was just in comparison to the horrible pain of Hemispheres. But it seemed so fresh and energetic, and there was a really good vibe to the whole session. We weren't so far from home, not so isolated from family, in a new studio. You walk in and there's this beautiful view of this lake and the Laurentian Mountains. So it was a very happy, good vibe record. And we finished it very quickly. I think 5 or 6 weeks. Leading up to the sessions at the iconic Le Studio in Morin Heights in rural Quebec, the band had taken their longest break yet. They'd had 6 weeks to recharge. The band enjoyed a rural retreat before entering the studio, with writing and rehearsals taking place at Lakewood Farms, near Flesherton, Ontario. This mirrored their approach to Hemispheres and was something they also did for the next album. The sessions ran in September and October of 1979, toward a release date of January 14th, 1980. At the farm, the gear was set up in the basement, and Neil had some space for lyric writing, which he could do in a cottage nearby. The songs were further honed during a handful of warm-up tour dates, as well as demo sessions at the Sound Kitchen, Terry Brown now presiding. It was the first album we did at Le Studio, and it was such a treat to work there, notes Alex. We set up a volleyball net and court outside of the front door of the house we were staying at, which is by the lake. We put lights up so we could come back at 2 in the morning when we were finished recording and play volleyball for a couple of hours and drink and all that stuff. It was about a mile to paddle or row from the lake to the studio from the house. That's before Le Studio became a big complex, so it had a very homey vibe to it. Owners Yael and Andre Perry were just wonderful people. We had some great dinners. I have very fond memories of it. That was a very traditional period. We had just gone from that last concept, Hemispheres, and we had been recording in England. But that one we recorded at Le Studio, but mixed it in England, at Trident. It was an attempt to condense our songs a little bit, be more economical, try to get as much as we could in that 4 to 5 minute framework, rather than 8 to 11 minutes. That became a regular thing, an obsession, says Geddy, keying in on Alex's mention of volleyball. That was one of our early introductions to sport activities. We'd finish at 1 in the morning or whatever, and we kind of perfected the art of night volleyball, and we played even in the winter. We'd have a few drinks and get a bit fortified after the session and go out on the volleyball pitch. We built light standards and had it lit so we could play at night. And sometimes we'd even play after dinner a little bit. But then we'd get back into the studio and our hands would be all swollen from punching this stupid ball. We were like, I don't know if we should be playing like this after supper. It's on a kidney-shaped lake called Lac Perry, after the founder, Andre Perry, explains Neil, as, years later, he walked through the burned-out ruins of the studio, at this point consigned to be taken over by nature. And at the other end, there's a beautifully appointed guest house that we would stay in month after month over the years, and it's only 6 hours from home. All of us lived in southern Ontario at that time, so it was convenient. We could even have our families up to visit. It was very much a home away from home. In wintertime, I would cross-country ski between the guest house and the studio. I would get up in the morning and go cross-country skiing and then ski right into work, because all the trails link right along here. It became such a nice escape. A lifetime passion was formed here. The assistant engineer taught me how to cross-country ski. The late Robbie Whelan. What a workplace to walk into every day, reminisces Peart. I mean, I'm a lifetime nature lover anyway. And to be exposed to this view, changing through the seasons? We worked here first time in fall, which was glorious, and then later in winter and summer and spring as well. There's a mountain that goes up opposite the guest room, dining room, and every morning we'd watch the autumn colors change on that hillside. And the 3 of us, we actually hiked up there one time. We often have subgroups that we write as, and one of them, our new wave romantic group, was called the Fabulous Men. And the 3 of us hiked up to a high ski trail called the Portageur. I'd ski by it in winter, so I knew it was there. And I led us up there and I carved it into the tree, the Fabulous Men. Probably still there. In the summertime, there were paddle boats on the lake or a little rowboat, continues Neil. Oh, and there were Alex's radio-controlled planes. There were many stories of him crashing and us chasing them. One of them went down way across the lake in the woods, and all we heard was bzzz crash. So we went across there in the boat with the radio control thing, and he worked the servo, and we'd all be creeping through the woods listening for a beep-beep. And sure enough, there it is up in the tree. So all kinds of personal friendly adventures like that. And being immersed in the French-Canadian scene was, for me, life-changing. Because in 1980, I bought a cabin and have had a place here ever since. I loved the cross-country skiing and snowshoeing in the winter, and the rowing and swimming in the summer. It still really speaks to me, this area. In the autumn, of course, the colors are spectacular. There's so much history here, both personal and professional. Thinking of those first few records, Permanent Waves, Moving Pictures, Signals, and Grace Under Pressure. So much that happened here. About Permanent Waves, Neil says, in those days we all recorded together in the room, all of us. All of us were learning the song and interacting with each other's parts. So a lot of stuff was hammered out, is the best way to put it, here. By playing it over and over again. That's the way we worked in those days. Everything on the Permanent Waves record came together in a relatively short period of time, adds Geddy, surveying the whole experience, but reflecting on how prepared the band was. In fact, it was one of the most pleasurable and easiest albums for us to record. It was just one of those great writing sessions. At that time, it was still 3 of us sitting around, throwing ideas together and writing together in typical garage band style. We would write 2 songs, rehearse them, take them into the studio, and lay down live backing tracks. Everything just clicked. Morin Heights was beautiful, and the engineer was terrific. It all came together in a very quick and spontaneous way, which I think is reflected in the songs. Subsequently, we've tried to maintain that over the years. It's much more interesting to try to take that idea of being progressive and not do it in a way that people expect you to be progressive, continues Geddy, further attempting to articulate what was different about the songs on this album. What is a progressive band? Oh, you do a concept album that has space involved, and here's the long instrumental portion. Here's the overture. That to me just seemed less interesting than saying, okay, let's do 10 individual songs and each one of them can be a mini concept unto itself. And it's okay that there's a thread that connects all those songs. And the thread is the concept, right? It's not the repeating melody lines or the repeating elements that keep reappearing. To me, that was a step forward. That was Rush progressing, and not just staying in the same mold we had cast on 2112. But it was a challenge. Can we write a song that's 5, 6, 7 minutes long? Those are short songs by our standards, and still deliver something really interesting musically? Is there enough time to be musically adventurous in 5 minutes, and yet tell a different kind of story? That was the whole key, and that began 10 years of experimenting. And it's a never-ending experiment, still to this day, really. Structurally, it was interesting to see if we could be very aggressive one moment, very melodic another. Still have those instrumental sections that have a climax and a peak. That's the way you would structure a 10-minute piece. But shrink it all down and see, does it sound edited together? Does it still have a flow? Does it still have a rhythm to it that feels good to listen to? Those are all the things every writer of that genre of music has to deal with. And we were obsessed with it. But I think we spent 5 weeks, 6 weeks making that record. It was just boom, boom, boom. And then we went to England and mixed it at Trident. Without the difficulty of hemispheres, we never would have found Trident Studios. So everything happens for a reason. All the crappiest experiences of your life prepare you for the next step. They came very well prepared for that album, with a lot of pre-production, says Terry, obviously pleased with the contrast to the previous project. They had spent an inordinate amount of time rehearsing, so they came to the table with things finished, as it were. We didn't spend as much time together as they spent together preparing the songs. That was a big change. It was a fun record, and it wasn't easy. It was hard from a playing standpoint, but again, they were really starting to push the envelope as players. There was a strong division between hemispheres and permanent waves, reflects Neil with respect to the compositions, even though we still had long pieces and a lot of extended arrangements and instrumentation and so on. But there was a change of attitude in the late 70s and in the music we were responding to. The spirit of radio incorporates stylistically and, again, implicitly what all that was about. And from permanent waves, that set us up to be able to do moving pictures. What we decided to do at the end of Hemispheres was realized with moving pictures. Very often that's the case. There'll be a whole album's growth necessary to take us to where we're going. And I remember a critic around that time in the 70s saying he just wished he could give us a big kick in the direction we were going. And that was a nice criticism, you know, and one of the few worthwhile ones we ever received. That was really thoughtful. I remember Geddy pointing it out to me, how great that was. He was acknowledging that we were going in the right direction, but it was taking too long. When they came up with the material for permanent waves, it was pretty exciting, says Terry, because it was so different. But I hadn't had the conversation. We need to come up with something shorter or more concise or different. Hemispheres was a hard record to make, and it drained everybody creatively, so it seemed only natural that the next record was going to be quite different. You couldn't do two of those in a row. The engineering credit on Permanent Waves went to Paul Northfield, who begins his long association with the band at this point. It was September of '79, and I was working in Morin Heights, Le Studio. At that time, the studio's reputation was built on not just the equipment, but the people who worked there. Its reputation had already started to rise, as there had been some great hard rock records done there. And it was convenient. It's in Canada, and it's a beautiful area. When people came to the studio, either myself or Nick Blagona, the other engineer, would be assigned to engineer the projects. There would be myself and an assistant, and in this case it was Robbie Whelan. In terms of Paul's history, he explains, "In the case of the studio, I was hired because of my credentials, because I'd worked in London for 4 or 5 years, and I'd gotten a track record of working with people like Gentle Giant, Emerson, Lake and Palmer, and Yes, and to some degree Steve Howe. I had a resume, so I think they suddenly saw an opportunity to have somebody in the mix who had a different point of view, and a point of view they really liked. And people often used house engineers. So when they walked in the door, I kind of assumed I was going to be sitting in the engineering seat and Terry was the producer. I made that assumption from day one. And I sat down and talked to them about it. This is how things work out here. This is a good place to set up drums. And I think in that moment I probably sold them on the idea of, oh, okay, let's have Paul sit in the engineering seat and Terry will sit in the producer's seat and this will be a change. It wasn't until later that I realized Terry did a lot of the engineering himself. That's the way it was. I guess at the end of the day, they probably came and met me and realized I had a lot of experience that might be interesting to bring to the table. And so Terry decided to take the producer's seat rather than doing both jobs. And we worked from there. I did all the hands-on stuff, and he would be overseeing the whole project, as a producer often does. There was a lot of camaraderie with the band and with Terry, continues Northfield. It was very much like a boys' club. Becoming part of the recording process with Rush was entering into their world. Because they spent so much time together on the road, working a ridiculous amount of time, and when they were not on the road, frequently either writing or recording, they had a sort of insularity about their environment, and so obviously that included Terry, and subsequently included us, myself and Robbie. We would often eat with them, most times, actually, for dinner. Essentially for 2 months during the recording from beginning to end. We were recording 12 hours plus a day, 7 days a week. So that's the atmosphere at the time. About his role as engineer on Permanent Waves, Paul says, I made a lot of suggestions as to what the best places in the studio were, because I knew the room and the basic setups and the idiosyncrasies of the equipment we had. Because at that time there wasn't the same level of standardization you have now in studios. And there wasn't the rental aspect of recording. Now you can pretty much go anywhere and have any equipment. And if you don't have it, you can get it within a day or a few hours. You can have it shipped to you as a day rental. That didn't exist then. Each studio had its particular strengths and weaknesses, and those contributed toward how records sounded. And even the monitoring and speakers we used, we were mixing and recording using very large speakers that were mounted in the wall, in the ceiling, above the control room window. And that has a profound impact on the sound. There was no uniformity. These days there is relative uniformity. If you don't like the speakers when you walk into the studio sitting on the console, you go and get the ones you like. But those small, high-quality speakers didn't really exist in '79. That's not to say none existed, but it wasn't until probably the mid-'80s or the early '80s that things like the Yamaha NS-10 became popular. But at that time, part of my role was to be like, okay, I'm familiar with this room, this is the equipment we have, these are the good things we have, try this, try that. Paul also understood the narrative the band was writing for itself, concerning the previous album and this one. It was just fairly explicit. I think they had decided they'd indulged themselves to such a degree in doing anything they wanted to do musically. If they felt like they wanted to stretch a certain section out for 5 minutes because they really enjoyed playing it and wanted to experiment with it, they just did it. I think after having done that with Hemispheres, they wanted to say all of the important things in a smaller, more concise way. And obviously it has its benefits, because it makes it easier and more accessible for people. If they want to be heard on the radio, it's very hard to play a 12-minute song and get any airplay. Although that seemed to be very secondary. Paul continues, it seemed to be the challenge of being able to say something concisely that appealed to them. They were very much an idealistic band, probably driven by the fact that in the early days, when they did what other people said, it always went invariably wrong. And when they just did what they wanted to do, they got a really great response from their fans and their career blossomed. So they were very idealistic about what they did. Now we're doing this because we want to. This is the direction we're going because we enjoy it. Their desire to change and be different and challenge themselves was even down to the recording process. I remember it driving me a little crazy in the early days for moving pictures and permanent waves. They had this idea that whenever we recorded anything, even if we got it and everything sounded good, particularly the drums, then we would change all the microphones on the next song, for the purpose of not wanting to repeat themselves and to be creative, which in theory is very interesting. In practice, there are certain microphones that are really excellent for doing certain jobs, so to change them for creative reasons, for change's sake, was actually like, oh really? Some of it may have been a certain naivete, but it was very heartfelt. This is what they do. They're not really interested in conforming to anybody else's preconceived ideas of what they should or shouldn't do. Paul says Geddy took a particular interest in the production side of things. Yes, Geddy did take a more hands-on approach. He was there all the time, sort of watching, sitting at the side, present pretty much every step of the way. Sometimes when Alex was playing a solo, it would just be Terry, Alex, and myself in the control room. But even so, I think Geddy was there lapping it all up and being a part of it. He was like a sponge, trying to suck up everything that was going on in the studio. He was there in the control room for almost every minute of making permanent waves and moving pictures. One other thing about Geddy, he was the first bass player I've worked with that came in with an overdrive kind of amp sound. Although Chris Squire was also doing that at that time, using a Marshall head and a Marshall 4x12 for the growl part of it. That may have also been a bit of an inspiration for Geddy, because they were both Rickenbacker players. But Paul and Geddy never really talked about Yes. Northfield says that was more an unspoken thing. The fact that Rush were playing progressive music, albeit a more metal-driven kind. They really liked the arrangement depth that was there with the best of the progressive stuff, and the experimentalism and the indulgence that works both ways. It can be indulgent in a negative way, but also liberating. It's like creatively you just do what you like rather than what is formulaic and what fits for a pop song or a successful song. You go, I love the way this thing plays. I love playing this riff. I want to play it for 5 minutes because I love it. Extended jams, even if they're highly structured, they're part of what Rush was all about. That ignoring the formulas of the record business, to just do what they liked doing, and what they were getting a response from their audience with. Geddy came in with his bass sound and with his attitude and his playing and was looking for us, Terry in the new studio and me, to actually capture that, and sort of surprise them maybe with something new. Addressing Geddy's temperament, Northfield reflects on his humor and his focus. which kind of flipped back and forth. 1 minute he's being very relaxed and irreverent when...
Sample complete. Ready to continue?